Shift Happens podcast.
It's often a good thing when smart people and strong organizations come together. But if these groups aren't using the same collaboration solutions, it's safe to say there will always be a disconnect. This problem will complicate any business merger, so it's critical for IT leaders to deliver tools and training to ensure everyone is on the same page. But there's a lot more to consider, especially during the pandemic. Today, I'll speak with Paul Butticaz of Truist, now the sixth largest bank in the US due to a 2019 merger. We'll talk about some of the strategies Paul used to bring tens of thousands of people together and how you can replicate that success.
Shift Happens podcast. Shift Happens podcast.
Welcome back, everybody, to Shift Happens podcast. I'm your host, Raymond, Chief Brand Officer here at AvePoint, Microsoft Regional Director and MVP. For today's episode, I'm joined by Paul Butticaz, Enterprise Architect for Modern Workplace Services at Truist. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hey, Dux. Thanks for having me.
Paul, I'm so intrigued about your background and in the industry you work in. Can you tell us more about your background and your journey to what you're doing today?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. I started in this industry a long time ago, and actually back in the early 80s as I came out of school. And I have seen a lot of change over the years. Obviously, back 40 years ago, it was focused around mainframes, big IBM, big Amdahl, big Honeywell equipment. And then all the way through the technology changes with mini computers, and then ultimately into distributed computing with laptops and PCs and so on.
40 years. When you talk about IBM, Honeywell, brings back memories of VAX, VMS. I started my career in assembler, and boy, talk about how time flies. And when you look at these transitions or transformations in the last 4 decades, and especially you're in the financial sector, what are the greatest shifts you've seen around collaboration?
That's a great question. And it's funny that I had a presentation that I did at Truist today for roughly 1,000 people, and it was on that exact subject. And what was interesting is we were talking about how people collaborated back 20 years ago. And we used email to push documents back and forth. Those were obviously, in many cases, Microsoft Office related documents. We used file servers, file shares, and we used something 20 years ago that used to be known as SharePoint Portal Services that was, I believe it's 20 years old this past week, believe it or not. So we were leveraging that 20 years ago. And what I found interesting is our journey to the cloud right now in Office 365 or Microsoft 365. We are still collaborating that way today predominantly. So 20 years later, a whole lot hasn't changed, at least for financial services, but we're headed in the right direction, Dux.
Paul, you bring up so many memories when you talk about these transitions. I remember when email first came out, because prior to email, fax machines was the thing. And I remember one time when I emailed something to a customer of mine. Email was new. And what happened was the customer printed my email, wrote on the paper, redlined it and responded to it, and then faxed it back to me. We laugh about that, but change really is the hardest thing. It's no different than even today, right? People are still emailing you attachments of Word documents, and in the email, they'll say, oh, by the way, it's also in Teams or in SharePoint.
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned faxing. I go back even before faxing when telex was a thing. So,
oh yeah.
But yes, things have changed. We've gotten better, but the journey isn't over for the Truist family at this point.
So one interesting thing also is, while sometimes we think about regulated industries like the financial sector are later adopters, I find that it's pretty much true across the board, especially in large organizations, regardless of what industry. Because the shift you're talking about 20 years ago, we're using SharePoint, and we're still kind of doing the same thing today. That's pretty much true across major industries. And when you think about the banking industry, right? Like, first and foremost, for those not familiar with Truist, Truist is one of the largest banks in the U.S. It's and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul. It's a result merger between SunTrust and BB&T, which is now Truist. In when you think about these transformations and changes, including the merger, how was it like? Certainly, this is a big disruption. I mean, can you walk through how technology enabled and supported these transitions and changes through, different situations in time, be it the merger or COVID-19? Can you share some thoughts around that, and how have people adopted and took advantage of these technologies?
Absolutely. So to your first question around Truist, yes, we it's the merger of SunTrust and BB&T. The two banks were number 12 and number 13 in the U.S. Together, we are going to be number 6. So it's a fairly large banking merger. In fact, it's the largest one in 20 years. At the current time, our focus is really around the merger. Now, keep in mind, the merger was announced close to a year and a half ago. Legal day one was back in December of 2019, and our customer day one isn't until February of 22. So it's a really long journey to bring these two large banks together, and so many different applications that have to be rationalized and brought together. Who's using whose mobile platforms, who's using the banking platforms, and so on. And there's so much work to bring together, and that journey is rather long. So our focus, primary focus right now, is that merger and all of the work going on with the merger. The challenge is, at the same time, COVID came in and is really challenging the teams from a collaboration perspective. As I mentioned, we're still collaborating like we used to many years ago. And we have folks that are doing, WebEx sessions. We have folks that are doing Skype meetings. We're using email to, again, move documents back and forth, or SharePoint. We absolutely probably would have waited for moving to the cloud, moving to Microsoft 365. But because of COVID, it's really kind of forcing our hand to provide better collaboration capabilities for our teammates.
So it sounds like during this transition or during this merger, in a way, you're kind of piloting Microsoft 365 for longer term use as well, correct?
We are. And I've actually been down this road a couple of times. Believe it or not, we were headed in this direction a couple of years back prior to the merger. The merger was announced, and we paused all of that work. And now we're back at the table again, which I'm blessed to have that as part of the work that I'm doing in the Collaboration Guild. So, but yes, you asked a couple of different questions, and I want to focus on one here around adoption within financial services and how that may or may not be leading from an industry perspective. And I will say, generally speaking, and rightly so, FSIs, or financial service companies, are slow to adopt newer technologies, especially cloud-based technologies. We're highly regulated. We have, obviously, concerns around around FINRA, the SEC, and as well as the FDIC. So there's all kinds of audits that are going on, and obviously have to have all of our security and compliance requirements met before moving to moving workloads to a SaaS service like 365.
So along that lines, and one another regulation I can think of is Sarbanes-Oxley, for example. That's another critical element of the financial service industry. Is there an example where you can share? So let's say out of the box, Microsoft 365, things that I may not even think about or consider to be an issue or a challenge, like creating teams or creating SharePoint sites. Are there scenarios where, to a layperson like me, think it's no big deal, but it's actually a big deal in financial services?
Yeah, there's several. I won't be able to go through all of them today, obviously, but the ones that are top of mind for me is oversharing, sharing too much information. Again, if you incorrectly share documents, whether it's internally or externally, with the wrong folks, and they, let's say, get something that's got either PII data or it's got customer information or it has account numbers, whatever it might have, and it gets into the hands of the wrong individual, internally or externally, that's not going to be a good day. I would also say that we have in financial services, especially when you have a investment banking and capital markets group like Truist does, you also have something referred to as information barriers. It used to be called ethical walls, but more predominantly it's called information barriers. And that's a really, really important feature of Microsoft 365 and how Microsoft has really worked with the financial services industry to bring those capabilities first to Teams and then ultimately into SharePoint slash OneDrive.
You bring up a good point around oversharing. So, for example, it's I'm sure most of everyone aren't malicious. They just really want to better work together. So I can go to a PowerPoint, a Word document, or a library and share content, right? But one of the biggest challenge too is that could be a risk. But in addition, like if you ask me today, do you know which documents you've shared? And of those documents that you shared, that people shared it as well? I don't know, right? And that could be a detriment to a lot of the things that you do. So how do you balance that? Like on one hand, you want people to be productive, you want people to be collaborative, but there are compliance needs that you have to meet in security regulations that you have to meet. So how do you balance that to serve people working at the bank?
Well, Truist, and I suspect it's equally true with all of our peers, especially when you're talking about probably the top 15 or so banks in the US. And, you know, any bank that's in the top 100 is certainly going to have certain security requirements and data protection requirements. But at Truist, it's not one size fits all. I mean, again, Microsoft has done an amazing job at bringing additional capabilities into their suite of products that sit in Microsoft 365, but there's still some gaps there. So bringing in third-party capabilities, whether it's AvePoint products, like you know extremely well, or it's other data protection layers that are brought in, or your CASB. We may not be able to meet with AIP or some of the other data protection capabilities native inside of Microsoft. So you layer on additional solutions. Maybe in smaller firms, smaller banks, they may be able to, determine that all of their requirements are met with, all of the standard set of tools out of 365.
And that's the beauty of the platform. Certainly, Microsoft will not be able to address every single use case and scenarios for every organization in the world, but they build it as such where there are organizations like us that can help complement and take customers the last mile, as they would say. Now, let's talk about the shift during the pandemic. So, in the last 12 months, how did the pandemic shift your strategy in driving adoption and change management, especially in the financial services industry? I would assume most of the work is in office and on site now. There's a lot of people working from home. What changed in terms of how people adopt this tool?
Well, it definitely pushed it to the forefront because, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, we struggled to optimize this collaboration experience with these disparate tools that we had inside the bank. And again, two cultures, two different sets of tools. I mentioned WebEx as being the predominant meeting solution or web conferencing platform for Heritage BB&T. Skype for Business was the platform that SunTrust had. So again, we had challenges around the cross meeting access until we worked through all of those details and made sure our teammates understood how to accomplish it, but it's still not by any means perfect. And when we pushed people to work from home, it was significant because we had a lot of folks that didn't even have laptops, Ducks. We had folks that had desktops that came into an office if they were back office employees, or they were traders sitting on a trading floor, let's say, either in New York or in San Francisco. We had to react quickly and figure out how we could get these folks online because basically, as you well know, the country was shut down and we had to keep our business running. So I feel like the companies that were already using these more modern workplace platforms had a distinct advantage over even over us, okay, because we had these disparate tools. So it rose this opportunity up and we accelerated the program. I don't know if COVID had not happened or the pandemic had not happened, if we would have waited to do 365 and deploy Microsoft Teams. And I realize Teams is not a focus just on meeting and web conferencing and live events and so on. It's so much more. It's really that what I call is a work stream collaboration platform. And it's being able to work with documents in real time and collaborate in real time as if you're sitting in the same room with somebody. And we just don't have that luxury anymore. And to be honest with you, I don't know that we'll ever return to the same style of work that we have in the past. We're shifting as well, where a lot of our teammates will work remotely permanently in certain roles. Now, if you have to go into an office, you'll go into an office, but it'll all be hoteling based, and you'll get assigned seating with the requisite social distancing and so on. But we're definitely into a new normal here.
I mean, you bring up lots of great points. I remember maybe around May or June, Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, came out and say what they're seeing is companies that would typically take 2 years for these digital transformation projects did it in 2 months because of necessity. And a lot of organizations weren't planning on going in teams, but they did primarily for the calling capability, for the video capability, which is good. But what's exciting is people are realizing, organizations are realizing, wait, Teams is not a one trick pony because people are so used to one solution app, right? Oh, Zoom is for calling, Slack is for a chat, and then we use this tool for that. So people are used to it, which is fair. Then when they start seeing Teams, oh, wait, I'm in a call and then I can share a document and then we're co-authoring and then I can initiate a call in the same context. I think that's really powerful. And we see a lot of organizations taking advantage of that. And I love your description where Teams is really your virtual workroom, right? It's the business OS because we're also seeing, wait, we can use Teams to integrate apps and even legacy systems. And I kid you not, I talked to a customer, they're like, we still use VAX. Is there an API that we can surface data in VAX VMS in Teams? I go, I'm sure you can. Why not, right?
Exactly.
So it's really exciting. It's really powerful. What's the feedback so far? Go ahead.
So, well, I was going to share with you one quick story. So we actually call this friction. Okay. So it slows teammate decision making. So we're drowning in this email on a daily basis. We have plenty of statistics. In fact, on average, I receive 232 emails a day. And it's hard to process that much information. Inability to work in documents real time was another struggle that we had. As I mentioned already, the complicated ad hoc collaboration sessions, whether it was WebEx or Skype or Jabber or whatever the case may be. And then the fact that anything that we did have, we didn't really have it in mobile. So there was so much friction in our collaboration stack that was causing this poor and slow decision making.
So now that you've deployed this technology, Paul, almost a year in, what's the feedback been like? Are people liking it, or are there still some camp where if they don't have to use it, they won't use it? What strategy did you use to drive and encourage sustainable adoption?
So great question, Dux. I appreciate you asking it. We've seen it from one end of the spectrum to the other, but that's where a well-developed adoption and change management program will help for the success of programs like this. So we have folks that are early adopters, they're the change champions, they love this kind of stuff. It might be predominantly the Gen Zs and the Gen Ys, the folks that grew up on the mobile phones, but we see it in the baby boomers. I use myself as an example. I despise email and love to communicate through workstream collaboration platforms like Microsoft Teams or Slack or some of the other platforms out there. But then you have the other end of the spectrum, and everything in between, by the way, where we have people that are reticent to try to jump in and they fall back on old habits. And that's where some of the analytic type data that comes out of the My Analytics and the data out of 365 can help you streamline to go after those individuals or those teammates that are struggling, and maybe they just don't want to reach out and feel embarrassed about it. But at the end of the day, again, a well developed adoption and change management program. And to be honest with you, our success focused on that heavily. Okay. It wasn't about the technology and the server infrastructure anymore. It's about how well you provide adoption services and change management services, because this is not a one and done, Dux. This is ongoing for as long as you're in these more modern workplace SaaS services, because they're constantly changing, new capabilities coming out. And if you don't keep that ACM or adoption and change management program going, you're going to eventually it's going to fall apart. So it's really super critical that you have a group in your organization that focuses on this full time.
You hit the nail on the head, Paul. Traditionally, and I'm guilty of this. I used to be a part of a IT organization. When we roll out, let's just pick SharePoint. When we rolled out SharePoint in 2007, maybe a few days before production, we're like, wait, we need to do adoption. Okay, let's send people to training. The thinking is if we send people to a end user training or power user training, 2-3 day session, life would be great. Don't talk to me again until 3 years when we upgrade again. But adoption, especially in this new world, is ongoing because you have to make it sustainable. There's a research that came out, and I forgot the name of the research, but essentially it says for adopting these cloud-based technologies enterprise-wide will typically take 12 to 15 months. So the question is, how do you make it sustainable? Just taking a training class one time won't cut it. Like you said, having champions, lunch and learns, and it doesn't have to be overly complex, but the consistency and sustainability is important. And to be able to do that, you have to have a permanent group and team like yourself responsible for it.
Absolutely. Agree with you 100%.
So this has been an awesome conversation, Paul. And before we wrap up, what advice would you offer to our listeners, especially if they're in this journey of Microsoft 365 now and really want to push to drive adoption if they haven't put together a solid plan or structure like yourself? What are some of the key tips or even resources perhaps that they can go and look for?
So key resources, obviously, depending on your Microsoft relationship, you have and what type of support you get from them. You have fast track resources that can help you deploy and, again, sustain that environment. You have great partners like AvePoint, as well as others out there that are, have a heavy focus on some of these more modern collaboration platforms. Not all of them do, by the way. There are many that are still focused on some of the on-premise or that old work nucleus mentality. So it's not everybody yet, but again, I think AvePoint has made that transition. I would say don't roll out everything at the same time. That's a mistake I made in my career. Roll out or deploy the right capabilities because Microsoft is this big behemoth. It's a couple of dozen, if not more, different services and applications. Don't go in and try to do all of it at one time because that'll overwhelm your end users or your teammates, and they'll get just turned off by it and stressed, and you will not have a good message coming back. Last but not least, I would say get your network ready for these cloud services. It's not the traditional hub and spoke model that we're used to coming from your VAX days or my IBM and Honeywell days and mainframe days. And even in later distributed computing, it was this hub and spoke model and routing all of the traffic back through data centers. That's not going to cut it when you're working with these software as a service platforms, whether it's Microsoft or it's Salesforce or it's ServiceNow, you name it. All of these SaaS services require a different approach when it comes to the network.
Paul, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. And we truly appreciate you sharing your experiences and your advice. And to everybody listening, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Shift Happens. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast and tell your friends and family about it. Have a wonderful day and everybody take care. Bye.
Shift Happens Podcast.
And there you have it. I'd like to thank Paul for joining us today, and I know I'll keep his wisdom in mind. Whether you're facing a big merger or simply want departments in your company to work together more effectively, the takeaways from Truist remain the same. Eliminate your outdated or redundant SaaS platforms. Deploy digital transformation gradually and make sure employee education is an easy and ongoing process. Bringing groups together takes hard work, and there's no question a smart rollout of Microsoft 365 can help, as our friends at Truist have shown. On a personal note, I'd like to thank you for listening to our 6th season of Shift Happens podcast. I can't wait to share more episodes with you this summer. We'll see you then.
Shift Happens Podcast. Shift Happens Podcast.